Today, we're going to talk a little bit about ideas. At this point, you've learned a little bit about the emergence of a new market economy in the United States. And so now I want to talk to you about how ideas impacted the further development of the United States in the early 19th century. We're going to talk about two major philosophical religious movements in the early 19th century. One, Transcendentalism. This is something you're probably going to learn a lot more about in your English classes, but we'll give you a little preview in here as well. Two, the Second Great Awakening, a sequel to that first religious revival of the 18th century. All right, let's start with some context. Let's remember that the market revolution was changing America at a rapid pace. One of the things that came with the market revolution of the early 1800s was westward expansion. As Americans were expanding west, so was American freedom, or at least the perception of American individualism. This was something that was noted by European visitors. When they came to America, they noticed this emphasis on individualism, rugged individualism, the type that would help you to survive and thrive in the Western frontier. Later, we're going to talk about something known as manifest destiny. This is the idea that America was destined, that we were divinely ordained to occupy all of the North American continent, and that we had a claim on these Western lands that, remember, at this time aren't necessarily part of our country. That anything, according to manifest destiny, anything that stood in our way was an obstacle to progress, and we had a right, a divine right, to remove those obstacles. All right, so we'll talk about that later, but it's important for you to know that the seeds of these ideas are being sown well before 1845, which is when that term first became popularized. So what was Transcendentalism? Well, the Transcendentalists insisted on the privacy of individual judgment over existing social traditions and institutions. They rejected turning to tradition or social custom when seeking ultimate truth. Most famous Transcendentalist thinkers were Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Transcendentalists believed that the truth is beyond or transcends, thus the name, what can be discovered using our five senses. Instead, they believed that individuals should turn to their inner light, like the Quakers spoke of, which would then in turn illuminate the highest truths for them. For the Transcendentalists, the life of the private man was supreme. It's what you found out when you turned inward. The answers were within. The individual already possessed the truth. All we had to do was attune ourselves to that inner light. So how did these ideas inform a response to the market revolution? How does the transcendentalist inner light idea relate to, or how did it relate to, the ideas driving the market revolution? Well, the Transcendentalists thought that most Americans during the time of the market revolution were beginning to place too much emphasis on material wealth and individual prosperity. Remember, to the Transcendentalists, ultimate truth was not going to come from the outside, but only from the inside. And American materialism and seeking after wealth was only a distraction. Later, in later chapters, we're going to talk about some social reform movements. And the Transcendentalists are going to be leaders of these social reform movements. And often what you'll see with the Transcendentalists is a withdrawal from society. Rather than engaging with society, they'll withdraw from society. Whether this is Henry David Thoreau withdrawing to a cabin in the woods at Walden Pond, or a group of like-minded Transcendentalists getting together to form their own utopian community, like we'll talk about at Brook Farm, it's a common theme among the Transcendentalists. A rejection of the cultural and traditional values that were being emphasized at the time of the market revolution. Okay, let's talk about this second idea movement, and that is the Second Great Awakening. You might remember the First Great Awakening from the 1740s and 1750s. We're now going to experience a second wave of religious revivalism in the United States in the early 19th century. One aspect of the Second Great Awakening, which is similar to, but greatly expanded from the First Great Awakening, was its democratization of religion. And we see incredible growth in denominations. We see already popular denominations of American Christianity explode in membership. We also see new sub-denominations entering the scene at this time. Another thing that we notice is a rapid democratization of preaching. The United States goes from having about 2,000 preachers to over 40,000 preachers. So it becomes a much more democratic enterprise. Most of the Great Awakening is happening in the western parts of New York. It will eventually become known as the burned over district for the fact that the Second Great Awakening had just kind of torn through Western New York. These are religious revivals, very similar to the First Great Awakening, emotional preaching, weekends, sometimes multiple day events, camp meetings that are just reinvigorating religious zealousness across the United States. Charles Finney, one of the leading preachers of the Second Great Awakening, emphasized man's role as a free moral agent, that we are responsible for our own moral choices. So even more than in the First Great Awakening, he's recognizing the individual and the freedom of the individual as an important truth. We're going to see, just like in the First Great Awakening, that this religious revival will cut across economic lines. It will cut across social lines, racial lines. You'll see all sorts of people worshiping together. Another important development, as we're going to see the social reform movements that will be born of this religious movement. Another important aspect of the Second Great Awakening was the response, again, like the Transcendentalists, to the market revolution. The preachers of the Second Great Awakening would rail against the greed, the corruption, the self-serving ambition of the market revolution. So we're starting to see, between the Transcendentalist movement and the Second Great Awakening, some resistance to this kind of all-in free market capitalism that is driving the market economy in the early 19th century. In our next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the limits of prosperity and the groups that weren't benefiting from the economic developments of the market revolution and how they responded.